Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ian Alton. I'm the Regional Social Protection Specialist for the Arab States with the ILO. Welcome to this session on social protection as an enabler of climate action and a just transition in the MENA region. This has been done in conjunction with socialprotection.org and also our colleagues at the International Social Security Association that we've done a few of these webinars with over the last year. So very welcome. I hope this will be an interesting discussion. Next slide, please. So just to remember, just a bit of housekeeping. This session is going to be recorded or is being recorded. And along with the presentations, there'll be a video link that will be sent to all of you afterwards so that you can review the presentation as you wish or at in your own time. There's also closed captions. And if you look in the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see the CC if you want to see AI generated captions to follow the discussion. Hopefully the AI understands my London accent. And there's also simultaneous interpretation, which you can see by the kind of globe symbol at the bottom, and you can switch between Arabic and English when needed or whatever your preference is. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of the flow and interaction, we have an introduction, some interactive moments. We'll be presenting the key findings of the ILO's World Social Protection Report to kind of set up the panel discussion that happens after that. And there'll be some more interactive moments. And then there'll be a Q&A with the audience and the panelists. And then I'm going to wrap up. And do feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, talk with other colleagues, but also share your questions as and when you want to the panelist or which panelist you want to address your question to. So please take that into consideration. Next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. So just before we get into the topic, I just want to explain a little bit about this Arab Compass series, how it was conceived, where it's from. So this initiative intends to put a spotlight on reforms and programs geared towards fostering integration within social protection across the region and beyond. And it's trying to provoke discussion at the national level and allow us to go into more deeper into topics and support specific reforms that you may be facing in your own countries and try to, find solutions and ways forward to address those reforms or the needs that you need to make in your country. So hopefully this contributes today to that, because this is a really important topic. Next slide, please. So just why did we choose this topic? I think it doesn't really need much of a justification, in the sense that arguably the climate crisis is one of the biggest challenges that we face globally and in the MENA region. It's an existential crisis, and the current trajectory of global heating and emissions continues to give us lots of alarm. And obviously the world urgently needs to change course. And in the MENA region, we see the impact of the climate crisis in many ways, but specifically with temperatures that are rising twice as fast as the rest of the world, above the global average, twice as fast. Things like extreme heat are increasingly becoming a threat to life in the region, as well as making the region potentially unlivable if things don't change. We wanted to try and make the link between social protection and climate action and the need to move towards a greener future in our flagship World Social Protection Report, which was launched in 2024, where it discusses this topic. And, for some of you, the links may not seem so obvious between social protection and climate action, but I hope by the end of this session, you'll begin to see those connections and they'll be much clearer. So this is the rationale for this session. And hopefully we deliver on this promise. Next slide, please. So I've already introduced myself as moderator, but we have 4 other panelists here today. We have Jana Bishla. She's a social protection and climate change officer with the ILO, and she was one of the authors of this report that I've mentioned, really drove this report forward. We have Monia Beyunis, who's Director of Operations, Control and Litigation at Kakobat. in Algeria. We have Dr. Mohammed Ali Mokhtari, who's a development economic researcher with if my translation is correct, the Swiss-Italian University in Lugano. And we have Shadwa Mahmoud Zaher, who's an economic advisor at the Economic Justice Unit in the Ministry of Finance. So just before we move into the panel discussion, we'd like to have a bit of an interactive moment. So my colleague is going to share the next slide. And what you need to do, you need to scan this QR code on your phone, or you can click on the link in the chat and give your response to this question. So our question is, when you think of the impact of climate change in the MENA region, what's the first word that comes to mind, or first phrase that comes to mind? And I'm going to do that myself and then see what we all come up with. So take a moment to share your responses and your reaction through that QR code. And hopefully shortly we'll see that on the screen, and we'll be able to see what people's reactions are. Okay, so heat is already coming out as a pretty big thing. That's no surprise. Irreversible damage for sure. You know, we are on course for that. Water scarcity for sure. That's a big problem in the region. It's really affecting agriculture and the livability of rural areas in particular. Heat waves, they're a big killer, right? Especially of people with pre-existing health conditions and older persons that have more difficulty in regulating their body temperatures. Yeah, agriculture again. Human lives are affected for sure. I mean, the direct consequences are on human health, jobs, and their income. It isn't, yeah, and the climate crisis isn't just about heating and climate effects, but also continuing pollution and ill health and the effects on you know, bodily health. I think actually some of the discussions we have today about converting fossil fuels into social protection benefits has important air quality effects, which are really important for respiratory illnesses and things like that. The lack of protection, yes, this is a big one. The lack of protection globally, but also in MENA, is a real challenge. So we really need to think about that. Migrant workers, for sure, they're really affected. You know, we know that in some countries, migrant workers are facing extreme temperatures when they're working outside in construction and work like that, and they need to be protected. So, I mean, these are all great contributions, and I think that really sets up some of the thematics that we try to address in this presentation, in this discussion. So I think we're good to move on to the first discussant, which is Jana from the ILO, and she's going to give you a kind of theoretical overview of our thinking on social protection and its relationship with the climate crisis. So when you're ready, over to Jana. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ian, and hello, everybody. A really big pleasure to be here and to be speaking about this. And thanks a lot for the organizers also for choosing this topic. So I will have the pleasure now to just give a very brief introduction to the topic. And then I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our panelists to really make some of this theory come to life with some of the very concrete examples that we're already seeing in the region. So yeah, I will just kick off with a quick overview of why social protection is an enabler of climate action and necessary for a just transition. Next slide, please. So why are we even speaking about this link on social protection and climate change? And I was quite encouraged actually by some of the points that came up in the word cloud, because I think they already show that people are thinking into that direction. So first of all, climate change is resulting in more extreme events around the world, as well as slower changes. This includes things like extreme heat, which many of you have mentioned, but also, of course, floods, storms, droughts, as well as more gradual changes that then lead to, you know, things like water scarcity, desertification, and so on and so forth. And all those effects and risks, they have the potential to exacerbate common life cycle risks, right? For example, they may lead to more job, income, or livelihood losses. There are, of course, the health impacts, especially of extreme heat, which we have already started discussing. So increased instances of sickness or even occupational injuries or deaths, but also there are risks of general increases in poverty and deprivation of vulnerable groups, which will then sort of get us stuck in the cycle where more vulnerability and increases in vulnerability even lead to more vulnerability to climate change, right? And then there's the other side of things, which is sort of more what we sometimes classify as the classic sort of just transition side, which is essentially that our transition towards greener and more sustainable economies and societies, while necessary, risks at least temporarily dislocating some workers that might be engaged in unsustainable practices or industries. Or it can also lead to temporary increases in prices, as we will see with on the discussion around the fossil fuel subsidy reform, for example. And thirdly, and this is I think somewhat of an underappreciated element to this discussion sometimes, is that social protection itself can actually also help reduce emissions and push forward the transition to environmentally sustainable economies. Next slide, please. Right. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes taking you through this conceptual framework here of how just transition, social protection, as well as the different areas of climate action relate to each other. So in a nutshell, what the just transition means is making sure that climate action, which consists of both climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, is implemented in a way that promotes social justice, enhances decent work, social inclusion, as well as the reduction in poverty and inequality. And I'd just like to spend a moment to demystify the two concepts of climate change mitigation and adaptation a little bit, because as you engage more in this space around climate change, you will hear those two terms a lot, and they sometimes cause a little bit of confusion because just of the way in which we interpret maybe the word mitigate or adapt. But if you just remember two terms when it comes to climate action, I think those are the two that would be really good to remember. So climate change mitigation is essentially about reducing or stopping the rate of climate change itself, right? So we need to address the problem. And we do that mostly through policies or measures that reduce emissions, whether that's about changing our energy systems, phasing out fossil fuels, investing in renewable energies, or stopping deforestation, or even the way in which people farm and conduct agriculture, right? So this is all about stopping emissions, and which essentially requires a transformation of our economic systems. And, you know, even though there is this focus on the energy sector, the science also tells us that it will affect all different sectors of the economy, right? So that is mitigation. And how does social protection relate to this? I've already started mentioning it. Social protection here is absolutely crucial to cushion any disruptions that may occur in this context. We know that overall investments in a transition will lead to net job increases. However, in that process, we can expect that certain jobs may either be lost or changed or disrupted. People might require support for reskilling or retraining, as well as support for unemployment in case of job losses. And then, of course, there's also the side of potentially providing financial compensation to households that may be affected by rising energy prices as part of the transition, for example, through the removal of fossil fuel subsidies. And I'm really excited that we will be discussing this in much more detail in a minute with our speakers from Iran and Egypt, so I won't speak about this too much. And of course, in this whole quest to reduce emissions, there's also something that social protection operations themselves can do to contribute to this. And one issue I think that doesn't get discussed very often, but that's actually really crucial, is that pension funds around the world hold very large amounts of assets, which they invest. And these investment choices of these pension funds can actually make a really big difference in the in the investment or not in renewable energies, for example. And it's very good also to see that several countries are making headway on this. For instance, Oman, which has recently integrated ESG principles into its fund investments. And then on the other side, we have climate change adaptation, which is all about dealing with the impacts of climate change that are already happening or that we are expected to happen, right? So we're really preparing for the impacts that is to come in terms of higher temperatures, in terms of water scarcities, droughts and floods. And again, social protection, of course, plays a really crucial role here, because what we do know is that climate change affects some people more than others, and that these basic drivers around poverty, exclusion, vulnerability that social protection addresses, in fact, drives also people's vulnerability to climate change, right? So it's really about reducing the vulnerability of people and workers before impact happens. And again, a really good example is one that we will hear about later in this webinar, such as, for example, the weather-related unemployment insurance in Algeria, which I'm also very excited to learn more about later, or providing access to health protection for everyone and ensuring that benefit packages actually cover climate-related illnesses and diseases. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you have started to become more familiar with how countries around the world are also increasingly leveraging social protection systems to provide additional emergency support to people affected by disasters, whether that's droughts or floods or storms, through emergency cash transfers and social assistance, the anticipation or top-up of pensions, disability or child benefits, or emergency unemployment assistance or worker retention schemes. Next slide, please. But what is it that countries need to actually do in order to prepare their social protection systems for climate change and a just transition? What is it going to take to get ready? And we like to speak about this sometimes in terms of a sort of two-way approach, right? First of all, we need to actually ensure that people that are at risk are covered, and that they're covered comprehensively against all the different risks that they're facing, right? So this is sometimes what we call getting the basics right, which essentially means continuing to work gradually towards a social protection floor, filling existing gaps in coverage, adequacy and comprehensiveness of the social protection system, paying attention to good governance and administrative capacities. So all these things that we already know we need to be doing anyway, but need to really speed up on and put much more emphasis on. And at the same time, there are also additional actions that countries can take to adapt or prepare existing systems and schemes to make them more responsive, flexible, and prepared. Next slide, please. So as Ian also promised you some brief results in terms of the latest World Social Protection Report, which some of you might already be familiar with. I just wanted to give you a quick overview, because it really tells us how we're doing in terms of that first part, which is getting the basics right and covering really everybody that might be at risk. In terms of the global coverage rates, we can see that there is progress, and that between 2015 and 2023, for which we have the latest data, there's been an increase from 42% to 52% of the global population covered by at least one social protection benefit. So is possible, and we are making progress. Of course, this also means that almost half of the world's population is not covered by any social protection at all. When we look at the different coverage rates by the life cycle risks, we also see quite big discrepancies here. For example, pensions, we're getting really close to universal coverage, with almost 80% of older people that have access to a pension. But there's other areas that are really important also for climate change and a just transition, such as unemployment benefits, where only about 17% of people that are unemployed are covered by unemployment benefits, as well as child benefits or health protection, where we also still see much lower coverage rates. Next slide, please. And of course, we also see regional disparities in all of this. No, I mean, the general sort of global figures tell us that about half of the world has access to at least one social protection benefit. But what the World Social Protection Report has also shown is that especially those countries that are the most vulnerable and exposed to climate change have much lower coverage rates. And in the MENA region, we also see that coverage still lags behind the global average, where we could see that in 2023, about a third of the population has access to at least one social protection benefit. But again, it's quite concerning to see that especially, benefits such as unemployment or even benefits for persons with disabilities or mothers with newborn and children are still having much, much lower rates. So when we think about those that are at risk of climate change and of being negatively impacted, we see that we still have quite a lot to do, and that really getting the basics right and bringing up those coverage rates is probably one of the best things that we can do. Next slide. However, besides really making a deliberate effort to fill existing gaps in the social protection system, there's also a range of options that countries can take to better adapt their social protection systems and schemes to the realities of climate change. And I'm really looking forward to hearing, again, some more concrete examples from our panelists later today. But I'd just like to give you a quick overview of what measures we are already seeing countries taking throughout the region, as well as throughout the rest of the world that can really help speed this up. So first of all, countries are working to better integrate climate and transition risks into their social protection policies and strategies. Again, a good example for this comes from the region where Jordan has just finalized its latest social protection strategy, which now includes a key pillar on resilience that seeks to explicitly address the impacts of climate shocks. Another important measure is that given the multi-sectoral nature of just transition policies, it's really important to also enhance the coordination among ministries, so between those engaged in social protection, but also other sectoral ministries engaged in in transition planning, as well as climate change and disaster risk management. A very interesting example that where the government a few years ago needed to develop a transition plan for over 300,000 fishermen that were affected by a fishing ban that was implemented for environmental protection, but which of course compromised the livelihoods of those working in fishing. And one of the big key success factors was the really close collaboration between the Ministry of Social Security and the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs, as well as the Ministry of Finance. Of course, when we speak about the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, for example, this is again something that will require really strong coordination among ministries, especially the Ministry of Finance. So I think the big sort of lesson here in terms of when we speak about the integration with social protection and climate change is, of course, that this really requires a multi-sectoral approach and enhanced coordination between different ministries. A third point is the integration of income support measures with active labor market policies, skills, and other just transition policy areas. And this is, of course, to ensure that affected workers cannot only meet their basic needs through things like unemployment assistance or social assistance, but that they're actively supported in finding more resilient and more sustainable jobs or livelihood opportunities. Next slide, please. Another option that we're seeing increasingly in countries is that they're integrating climate risks into the design of their schemes, as well as ensuring flexibility in eligibility criteria or benefit values and durations, which is really important, especially if we want to make social protection programs prepared to respond to extreme events, heat, or even crises such as floods or storms. For instance, in Brazil, the legal frameworks of various social protection schemes already foresee specific emergency provisions for the cases of calamities. For example, the unemployment insurance allows for an expansion in the duration of benefits in the case of an emergency. and social assistance programs have the option to add additional or enroll additional beneficiaries in the case of shocks. And all those provisions were recently activated when the country was struck by a very intense flooding in the south last year. And of course,
Jana,
yes.
just say 2 minutes more, please. Thanks.
Yeah, it's the last point. Thank you. And of course, the final point that I just wanted to raise, because we also saw in the word cloud earlier that the issue of migrants being brought up, is of course the portability of benefits both internally and across borders, which is really important, especially given the projected displacement and migration impacts of climate change. Yes, and that's all from my side. You can end on the last slide, please. There's a lot more information as well as various different examples in the latest World Social Protection Report, which of course you're very welcome to look at. And now I'm very much looking forward to hearing some of the very concrete examples that our panelists have to share from the MENA region. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jana. Amazing. Hopefully, if we have a bit of time at the end, we can explain the meaning of that picture on the World Social Protection Report, which caused a little bit of confusion, but there is a good logic behind that. Colleagues, I do encourage you to use the Q&A and send your questions as and when they come through, if you have questions for the panelists or myself or for Jana. But now we're going to go over to Madam Bayounis, and I'm going to ask a question to her. Madam Bayounis, in Algeria, the National Fund for Paid Leave and Weather-Related Layoffs in the construction and public works and hydraulics industries plays an important role in protecting workers from income loss during periods of severe weather. And I would love to understand more about how and why this scheme was established. How does it operate in practice? And what's been the impact? So if you could elaborate, please, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Madam Bayounis, we don't hear you.
Can you please repeat the question? Can you repeat the question? There was a technical internet problem with the connection.
No problem. So in Algeria, your fund, the Kakobat, plays an important role in protecting workers' income from losses during extreme weather events. So we'd like to understand a little bit about how that scheme came to be established. How does it function in practice? And what's been the impact to date? So if you could elaborate, fantastic. Thank you.
Yes. The Kakobat, which is the national fund for the unemployment due to extreme weather for the construction, public works, and hydraulics. It is a professional fund that had been established for the three sectors: the construction, the public works, and the hydraulics. It had been established on the 4th of February 1997. It plays an important role, as you mentioned, in covering the unemployment or providing compensation for the loss of income due to extreme weather conditions. Unfortunately, she's breaking up. Can you hear me? She's asking. It's a little bit breaking up.
I think maybe continue, but it's a bit difficult for the interpreter.
Thank you. I'm trying to say that this scheme had been established to maintain the health and safety of construction, public works, and hydraulics workers, because we know that it is difficult to work in such sectors. That is why social protection needs to be granted to those workers, and that had been done since 1997, since the establishment of the fund. In addition, the active enterprises in these sensitive sectors must be able to operate within the deadlines, and that is why the workers have to be well protected, because if a certain process is hindered by the extreme weather conditions like storms, floodings, high temperature, the suspension of the work due to such weather conditions is needed to maintain the health and safety of the workers. And to avoid the loss of the operations by the employer, then he pays the salary to the workers, and the fund would receive compensation up to 75% of the total income. In practical terms, the procedures taken by the fund are actually the employer would declare the interruption of the works through a new portal, a platform called تصريحاتكم, or your declarations in English. And through the electronic portal, the declarations are submitted electronically. I mean, the employer doesn't have to move to the fund offices in order to submit the declaration. The employer has the option to choose the e-portal. It is available. The employer can decide to submit remotely information about the suspension of the works. He can also move to any nearby facility to provide a physical submittal about the interruption of works. Do I keep elaborating about the procedures and the standards? Can I keep?
I think in the interest of time, we need to move to the next speaker, but I think we'll have more time to revisit the intricacies of the scheme in the discussion, I hope, and more. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Shukran. So just moving on now to Shadwa, because she's next in line, and then you, Ali. Shadwa, so in Egypt, I understand it's taken ambitious structural and fiscal reforms in recent years, including the gradual reduction of energy transfers, while also expanding social protection programs such as Takaful and Karama, I hope I say that correctly, and launching a new universal health insurance scheme. So in the context of future green transition measures, how can Egypt's social protection system further evolve to cushion households and workers from the adverse distributional effects of climate-related and structural economic reforms? Perhaps you could elaborate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be a part of this timely conversation. And I'll try to make my comments brief by addressing specifically the expenditure patterns that are evolving to cushion households, vulnerable households, against any kind of transitions and reforms. And as you've said, Egypt over the past years carried out structural and fiscal reforms, either by phasing out fuel and food subsidies, exchange rate adjustments, while also scaling up green policies. These reforms did succeed in reducing macroeconomic imbalances, yet created some sort of short-term income and price shocks, which impacted the most vulnerable the most. The good news is, I think, Egypt is adopting a comprehensive social protection schemes, and mostly forward-looking. And this is in a way to ensure aligning climate-friendly reforms while also managing poverty levels. And to highlight a couple of expenditure patterns, you can see that the allocation of the fiscal year 2025-26 budget increased the allocation for subsidies, grants, and social benefits by 16.8% from last year. Meanwhile, capping public investments by around 1.16 trillion Egyptian pounds, which to ensure fiscal discipline, while also repurposing this fiscal space towards social protection, green developments, and also private sector-led growth. This expenditure pattern reflects the strategic balance that the government is trying to do between fiscal consolidation and protection of critical social outlays. And I'd like to use this to highlight the adaptation of the existing programs to further cushion vulnerable categories in Egypt. Like, for instance, as you've said, Takaful and Karama is one of the targeted cash transfers that is really successful in Egypt, and I believe we're building on this. So we're increasing the spending on Takaful and Karama to 54 billion compared to 40 billion last year. This increased the amount of households being covered to 7.7 million compared to 1.5 million when the program kick-started in 2015. But on an equally important front, I'd like to address one thing that came up in the interaction, which is workers' displacement. Because if we're speaking about green transition, then we're assuming that workers will be displaced from legacy sectors like energy sectors towards the green economy in agriculture specifically. This kind of workers' displacements requires some kind of social protection, and I believe the social insurance law 148 in 2019 actually is a legal milestone. It set the legal base to make sure that the uncovered workers are now covered in the new law. So perhaps these displaced workers could now have a legal cushion where they'll basically be covered by social insurance, either temporary social insurance or top-ups related to tailored to their work situation. And one important thing that I'd like to mention was mentioned in the presentation of Yana, was basically the coherence of policies. So one important thing that we need to make sure we're addressing here is effective governance and governance among the different ministries in order to make sure that the environmental, financial, and social policies are coherent to achieve or better target the vulnerable groups. And I think we can build on the social registry that we have from Takaful and Karama, and also the initiative of the Egyptian government to have a unified social registry in order to monitor the losers and the gainers from this green transition, along with other reforms that Egypt might take into consideration in the future. So this will allow us to better tailor targeted and social protection measures that related to the green transition or other macroeconomic reforms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shadwa. That was like really very interesting. Lots of very important points made there. I actually look forward to reflecting on them in the discussion, hopefully. So thank you so much. Now over to Ali. We're going to talk about the Iranian fossil subsidy reform that happened 2010 and 2019. And this led to the introduction of what could be called a more conventional social protection benefit. In fact, it's one of the most prominent fossil fuel reforms that have happened in the region, but probably globally. And today, the scheme functions as a kind of quasi-universal benefit, covering non-contributory benefit, covering around 80% of the population, maybe a bit more. But this reform has definitely experienced a bumpy road along the way. And I note in your recent paper, in quote marks, fueling inequality, a novel estimate from large-scale reforms, which hopefully will be shared in the chat. And in that, you talk about how those fortunes have shifted over time. So can you give us a bit of a history of the benefit, how it's happened, and then we can get into a discussion later about its potential impacts on climate and greening? Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I am very happy to be here in very relevant event regarding social protection and climate change. And good news here is we have a solution really relevant to this topic, because the bad news is most of these fossil fuel subsidies concentrated in MENA, in North Africa and Middle East. But the good news is the most of these fossil subsidies concentrated in the oil-rich countries, which means this is possible to shift from this regressive and climate harmful fossil fuel subsidies to direct cash transfers, which is not feasible in any even advanced countries, because they should tax and finance these cash transfers. But based on the last year data, if we look at the ranking of 25 countries that paid most of these fossil fuel subsidies, we can see that most of these countries are oil-rich and from MENA. These fossil fuel subsidies contribute a lot to carbon dioxide and climate change. The estimation from International Monetary Fund shows that eliminating these fossil fuel subsidies prevent 1 million premature deaths by decreasing air pollution and also 36% carbon dioxide. Apart this environmental benefit, there is also social protection benefit when we shift from fossil fuel subsidies to direct cash transfers. And the good thing is Iran experienced this 2 times, as you said, Jan said clearly, in 2010, December 2010 and 2019. And in both periods, we can observe sharp decline in inequality in country, poverty reduction, and many other social benefits in this shift. And is this feasible for, or at the moment, is this feasible for the countries in the region? Absolutely, yes. If you look, the minimum amount of fossil fuel subsidies in the region is paid by Qatar, which is $10 billion US. And other countries, in other countries, it is much more. For example, in Algeria, we have 15 billion US dollar per year paid for fossil fuel subsidies. In Saudi Arabia, we have 77 billion US dollar. In Egypt, we have 65 billion US dollar for financing fossil fuel subsidy, which is completely regressive, completely environmental harmful, and market distortion. The experience of Iran shows that such a reform could be both pro-market and pro-poor. Our funding shows that more than 60% of population benefited from such a transition. And we estimate for the first time, there was a bunch of anecdotal evidence that this kind of fossil fuel subsidies are regressive, but there was no causal evidence. And for the first time, we provide this causal evidence that shifting from $1 US per capita per day from fossil fuel subsidies to direct cash transfer reduce 8% Gini coefficient of expenditure, which is the best proxy of inequality in the country. And the idea calls in many very famous book in 2015, oil to cash reform. But in the second part of this panel, I want to explain why if they are so beneficial, they are so unpopular. This is really important question to answer, and I think researchers in MENA and development economics should figure out which kind of infrastructure is necessary and governance capability to do this kind of reforms well.
I like the way you ended there, Ali. It leaves us wanting more. So in your next question, you're going to elaborate on, the resistance and why there's resistance, because I think that's a fascinating part of the discussion. So thank you so much. That was really interesting and shows the potentially untapped fiscal space that is there for social protection. I'm going to go back to Madam Ben Younes now. When she's ready. Hello. Salut. So Madam Ben Younes,
نعم أنا جاهزة.
given that
نعم
okay,
أنا
given
في
that
استماع.
climate
Oui.
so given that climate volatility is becoming an increasingly severe challenge across the MENA region, particularly with the growing frequency and intensity of heat, even killer heat, you could say. There's rising interest among social security administrations in developing income protection mechanisms for workers affected by extreme heat, especially in vulnerable sectors like construction, for example. So it'd be really valuable to hear what would be the lessons you would draw from developing such a scheme, and what would you convey to your colleagues working with a desire to introduce similar schemes in the region. So over to you.
Thank you. Since 1997, the fund had been working on covering for the unemployment due to extreme weather conditions. In the beginning, it was pertaining to the rainfall. Yes, we can hear you. Okay, so the fund was first providing income compensation for extreme weather conditions such as snow, strong wind, and rainfall. And then when the fund was able to see that it is possible to widen the scope of the compensation to cover the unemployment due to the extreme weather conditions pertaining to the high rise of temperature, that was in early 1997, we've been able to widen the scope of the protection to cover the temperature, because the extreme weather condition is very dominant, actually. And allow me here to say that in Algeria, we have 90% desert area. So the high temperatures are seen in the south, in the southern part of the country. And that is why the fund decided to support the extreme weather conditions, including the temperature. And that was unprecedented. No other country had been providing compensation for the high rise of temperature at the time. Algeria had then in 2017 widened the scope to cover the high mountains. In the same year, in May 2017, then in 2019, it covered the entire territories, the entire Algerian territories, in order to maintain the safety and health and security of the workers. We're applying quite the same procedures for the rain, the strong winds, and storms. The same standards apply in the event of a high rise of temperature. And of course, there are criteria to be fulfilled, to be met, and that would enable the fund to provide compensation for the high temperatures. And that is the same for the other conditions of extreme weather conditions. Actually, the criteria is not so difficult, and all of the services are numbered and digitized to facilitate the declaration process. As I said, the employer himself or herself would declare an extreme weather condition, or in this particular case, the high rise of temperature. Though the fund seeks social equality between the North and the South. It is because prior to 2016, declarations used to be received from the North only, where they suffer from rain and strong showers and snowy areas in the internal territories, while we were not able to provide for workers who are active in the South, in the southern territories that are known for the high temperatures that could reach very high standards according to the international standards and the Meteorological Institution of Algeria. The temperatures vary between regions. We don't find the same temperature level across all regions, especially that the South is known for the wide geographic areas. I mean that there is big variation, big area variations amongst regions. That is why we see disparities in the temperature across regions. And let me also mention that the employer, as I said, needs to declare, especially that when there is extreme weather condition and high temperature, in particular, the worker cannot keep working, otherwise that would affect his health and his safety. The employer actually is forced to declare that in order to remain within the limits and the deadlines. He has to never let the worker be dismissed or leave, quit the job. That is why he would pay the income, and the fund would receive the compensation. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you so much. Couple of things before we move to the next speaker is Madam Ben Younes. There's some questions for you in the chat that would be great if you could address. But I do want to say it seems that Algeria was really ahead of the curve here in terms of adapting schemes to be ready for a more volatile climate. And I think it's quite inspirational, actually. And you've been incubating these innovations that we can do in social protection that could really be quite powerful in other parts of the world, particularly the GCC, and even in more temperate regions of the world where we're now getting extreme weather. So yeah, really ahead of the curve there. I have many more questions, but I need to be quiet and respect the fact that we have 8 minutes for Ali to wrap up the panel discussion. And I'm really looking forward to asking you this question, Ali. So as we said, like this Iranian fossil fuel subsidy reform wasn't explicitly introduced, as I understand it, as a climate-friendly initiative, right? It was more about social cohesion, addressing the regressive nature of the fossil fuel subsidy, as I understand it. But my question is this. We know it encountered some problems along the way, but you've mentioned these important inequality reduction impacts, which are really impressive, actually. And I think your experience, or the experience in Iran, offers valuable insights in how the fiscal space can be created to strengthen social protection while simultaneously advancing ecological or environmental goals. And it discourages wasteful energy consumption. It improves air quality. You've talked about that, and that has positive public health implications too. So I would be interested on your reflections on what are the lessons for the other countries in the region that you mentioned have these enormous fossil fuel subsidies, and they want to expand fiscal space for social protection, as well as have a healthier environment and, hopefully contribute to greening of our societies. But how do you do it? Like, what are the pragmatics? Because it's not easy in terms of introducing these things. So I want to hear from you on that. So thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Jan. This is very important point. The main benefit of reducing fossil fuel subsidies is in environmental benefit. And this is well established in many studies show there is large environmental benefit for reducing fossil fuel subsidies. And many anecdotal evidence in Iran shows that the gasoline, diesel, electricity consumption trend really changed after this reform in 2010, which is really important. If you look at the other statistics, these large cities, metropolitan cities, Qahira, Cairo, Tehran, these big cities are always among the most polluted cities in the world. And I am almost sure that this kind of reform contributed significantly in air pollution and environmental benefit. However, there is no precise study so far, but this is kind of next project that other researchers or colleagues could conduct, which is really important. Regarding the feasibility and fiscal feasibility of such a policies, as I said before, the magnitude of this fossil fuel subsidy is pretty large in the MENA. In Iran, it is more than 100 billion US dollar at the moment, and in 2010 it was around 80 billion US dollar. While the other social protection for medicine and other stuff was much less in magnitude. Therefore, there is no, I think, there is no question regarding the feasibility of this kind of reform. But there is bunch of barrier for them, which is really important to mention here. I remember that in the time of reform in Iran, there was large discussion in media regarding that, okay, if we pay cash to people, it is another engine of economy. If people stop working, it is not good for economy. Later, many evidence from developing world showed that this is not right. This is not true. And even we observe in some countries a small increase in labor supply. The classical theory of economy predict that if people get unearned income, which is apart from labor, it is likely that they reduce their labor supply. But we should consider always in developing world, there is a bunch of other barriers. There is quota. People maybe are not well educated. They are low skilled. They need some skill. They need better nutrition and health to provide their labor supply. And so far, two studies from this large reform show zero impact on labor supply in the country. And the good thing, other good thing is the reduction happened in child labor supply, which is very good because they transitioned from labor market to a school. And there is evidence on ongoing under review project that we are doing. This is the first study that shows the such a cash transfer can increase literacy rate and education in a scale of country, which is really important. Therefore, the findings so far for oil to cash reform is really positive. That's why we believe that we should push it. We should find the barriers that prevent this kind of useful subsidies. And we have some hypothesis for barrier. One barrier is, okay, the high income group never supports such a reform because they are actually, they lose in such a oil to cash reform, high income group. But usually countries and government care about low income group that they significantly benefit in such a reform. But regarding low-income group, another problem arises that there is no evidence that low-income groups support such a reform. Why? This is because many low-income groups don't believe their government action, and they also are not sure regarding the risk of such a reform and whether they receive this cash transfer or not. In Iranian reform, 97% of population received this cash transfer. When we looked at only the 7% of population that excluded from this cash transfer, we observed large decrease in nutrition, health, and even children exposed in early life to such a reform. Therefore, it is very important to capture this risk and make households sure that they receive cash. My solution is that countries can pay the cash in advance and then later start to identify, okay, if some people are not eligible for receiving this cash transfer, reduce this. For this reason, we observe many protests in developing countries when they want to do such a reform. There is a bunch of evidence in developing world, especially almost sometimes in advanced world, that they protest against such a reform, and poor sometimes protest against such a reform. Therefore, we should capture the risk. We should consider the administrative capacities of country, bank account delays in payment, and provide some application, mobile money, other stuff to cover this risk for low-income group. And one concern would be, okay, is it possible to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies from tomorrow and without any cash transfer? The answer is no. This would be harmful for poor. Why? Because despite these fossil fuel subsidies are regressive, they benefit high-income groups significantly. Another problem is if we look at the share of energy and fossil fuel in the balance sheet of household, we understand regarding the share of poor usually is higher, and this is problematic. Without cash transfer, adjusting the price is not recommended and would be harmful for the poor. But replacing fossil fuel subsidies with direct cash transfer, first of all, is feasible. Secondly, is really environmental friendly and good for public health of country. We should figure out better way to capture the risk for low-income group, try to reduce this risk, ensure them at the time of the reform that they receive this compensation scheme to be able to perform such a reform. I'm almost sure that this is feasible in many countries, more than 10 countries in MENA, that they pay, all of them pay more than 10 billion US dollar per year for these fossil fuel subsidies.
Ali, I think that's a great point to leave it on, that there's a lot of promise in other countries. And, you know, if it's done well, it can really have a meaningful impact on inequality, on poverty, particularly for the lowest income groups, right? Which is something we're all concerned about. So I take that message as well as your other things. So thank you. I hope we get a little bit more time to talk about it. Just in the interest of time, thank you, panelists. Really, like, super inspirational, great examples. I hope this has been really useful to the audience. We're just going to move into an interactive moment again now, just to change the flow a little bit, and then we'll come back for a Q&A session and a final wrap up from me. So Paolo is putting up another QR code, and I think in the chat box there will be a link for you to respond to this question. But colleagues, in a short sentence, what's one practical way social protection could help support climate resilience in your country? Let us know your ideas, perhaps based on some of the discussions you've heard now. You've already started to begin to make some of your thinking. So I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say here. Answers are just coming in. Take a second. Should do it myself as well. All right, so I think it is the responses are about to appear on the screen any moment now, I hope. Thank you, Paolo. All right, so unemployment insurance has come up there. That's definitely got a role to play in protecting workers from extreme events when there's a disruption of business function or everyday function. But also, there's a lot of talk about how good unemployment insurance can help workers transition to different sectors if we need to decarbonize. There's a lot of talk about that, but I think if if I recall Jana's point correctly, this only applies to about 1 million workers worldwide. Coverage for sure to protect individuals against climate hazard is, the extension of coverage is super important to protect against ordinary life cycle risks that we all face, but now those additional risks that we face because of climate change. That's a really good point about provision of climate insurance for farmers. I think one of the areas globally we have a lot of work to do is on the extension of social protection to agricultural workers, because they're especially vulnerable. Pension investments is one of my pet topics, something I would love to see more on. There's something like 20% of all global capital is invested in public and private pensions, and how you invest those pensions literally determines the health of the planet, because it can be in fossil fuels or in greener sectors, and it can help move that just transition. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Health provision for all, the health consequences of the climate change impacts are clear for sure, and we need to, protect health so that people aren't entering a more volatile climate future in better health, but also deal with the health impacts of the climate crisis, right? With particularly from heat and people that have pre-existing vulnerabilities. Seeing some more come in. Definitely the greening of public transport is part of the solution. How that links to social protection, maybe that would need to be thought about a bit more. But I think, moving away from fossil fuel subsidies and, individualized car transportation more towards public transportation is an important one for sure. Okay, so I think it's time now to end this interactive moment and move into the Q&A session. We have 10 minutes for that. So thank you everyone for your contributions in terms of sharing your thinking on this question. So thank you, Paolo. I have a question for Madam Benyounes, sorry, if that's okay. And the question is, I've lost the question. Oh, sorry. How does, across the region in MENA, but in Algeria, the construction sector shows high rates of informality? How does CACOBAT take into account the needs of workers in the informal economy in the sectors that you cover, or how could that extension to informal workers be achieved, either in Algeria or beyond the country? That would be our question to you.
I will try to answer because I had some problem with the connection. If my answer is not clear, please let me know. So, with regard to CACOBAT fund and the rate of subscription paid by the employer is 0.75% for social security funds in Algeria, and it is half paid by the employee and another half by the employer. So the employer has to pay 0.375 from subscriptions to a social security funds, and the same percentage should be paid by the employee as well. And then, as I said, the employer shall pay wages whenever the business stops, and the fund, based on the conditions, should pay to the employee. The employee has to work for 200 hours during the 2 months prior to the interruption of the work. So 200 hours of the 2 months before the interruption of the work. This is a condition for the fund to pay compensation to the employer. So as I have previously said, the employer is paying the wages to the workers whenever there is suspension of work, and the fund, in order to be able to get compensation up to 75% of the wages. So this is a precondition for the fund to pay the compensation. And also, whenever the fund has launched a media campaign in order to expand coverage to compensation of extreme heat, one of the recommendation was to social security funds willing to integrate the compensation has been an IT system, to have an IT system, and also to launch media campaigns at the level of, or on TVs, on radios. And this has been a recommendation. Also, the fund can enter alia to pay compensation for extreme heats, because this bad weather condition in Algeria, at the beginning, it was very difficult to urge employer to stop the work whenever there is extreme temperatures or extreme heat, because in the south of Algeria, institutions used to reschedule their work, for example, to work in early morning because before we have very high temperatures, or to work whenever the temperatures decrease, they can continue working in the business or in the project. But because of the extensive media campaigns, and also at the level of the fund, the individuals in charge used to visit, to do field visits in order to make the institutions aware of the importance of this fact or this matter.
Thank you so much. And that's a very comprehensive. Sorry, I realized I was muted. Thank you so much. You really gave a comprehensive explanation, and you also made the point it's not just about the social insurance scheme itself. It's also about occupational health and safety rules, about working at the right hours as well, and adapting working time, which is a really important complementary policy. So I'm going to ask Shadwa, if I can ask you a question. I'd love to hear a little bit more on something that you mentioned in your presentation, which was, or in your contribution, which is, I like the way you said this, is that there's winners and losers, or, there's often losers in these kind of reforms. And if I understood you correctly, you were saying it was an opportunity to extend social insurance to these informal workers that were like losers, if I've understood you correctly. But I'd love you to elaborate a little bit more on what you meant there. And I hope that question's clear to you, because I think that's an important point you make.
I think what I meant there is basically when the green transition has happened, like any other macroeconomic reform, what will happen is that some sectors will vanish along the time or phase out along the time, which is basically because of the decrease in subsidy and also the decrease or the reduction in incentives towards the suppliers or the private sector. So then unemployment will appear in these sectors, or migrant workers will move from, like, think about fuel sectors moving towards more renewable energy and water efficient sectors, because then there will be the incentives from the governments towards the private sector in these sectors, and then they will be incentivized to employ more workers, maybe at a higher levels of wages. So I'm sorry, just a sec.
No problem. Take your time.
Unintended. So so basically, because of this displacement of workers, then you need to make sure that the social protection system is ready to accommodate for such kind of cyclical unemployment that might happen at this point. And also because of the changing in the type of work that happened after COVID, where actually digital work is evolving more and more. So types of works will evolve as well because of the green transition, where again, you need to make sure that the unemployment insurance and the benefits for unemployed within this cyclical transition is activated and effective. So when I said winners and losers, because we're using targeted cash transfers, you now need to know who left when and where. You need to have the right data at the right place in order to be able to target efficiently those lost from this transition towards gaining in other sectors. So this is what I meant by losers and gainers in a nutshell.
Understood. Yeah, and thank you so much for that really excellent clarification. Appreciate it. Question to Ali, if you can come back online. Ali, one thing I wanted to ask, if I understand correctly, when the Iranian fossil fuel reform was first introduced, I understand there was a really strong communication campaign from the government, why we are doing this, why it makes sense, right? And for me, that it seems that when you manage these reforms, you need that transition to be very carefully managed. So I'd like to know a little bit about that and what you think about the communication from the government to the public and the kind of lessons there. But a second question I have for you is, you know, you've had this universal cash transfer, if you like, available now for a decade or more, and you're saying it's as many as 90% of the population. Does the population own it now? Do they see it as like a national dividend from oil wealth, for example? I mean, what's the public perception of that now? Because you've managed that transition. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. This is very important and good question. Yeah, the public campaign, I think, had a really important role to make the transition in 2010 well. But unfortunately, the government in 2019 didn't manage this public campaign. This is very good lesson for countries in the MENA, that if they want to do such a reform, they should have some public information and public campaign for that, well-prepared campaign for that. In 2019, despite the benefits of reform, the people protest again. It was one of the darkest and worst duration in the country. Many poor area protested against this. Why? Because first of all, there was no public campaign for that. Secondly, it was not clear who received cash and who not. And at the end of the day, they paid the cash to more than 70% of population. It was much easier to manage if they paid the cash in advance and ensure the people that they receive this cash transfer to reduce the risk. The risk of price hike in energy is high for household. We should ensure a household against this price hike. The campaign can do it. The payment in advance can do it. This is very, very important. And I think the steps should be done very carefully to prevent this kind of protest. The typical kind of fossil fuel subsidies encountered large social resistance and protest in many countries. As I said before, the high-income group are expected to resist against such a reform because they're gonna lose. And the bad news is they usually have media and propaganda against this. The low-income group that should be supporter of such a reform actually exposed to a risk of price hike. Therefore, it is much, much better to clear everything in advance, how much the price will increase, how much cash a household receive. And then finding shows that it was really beneficial despite before ex ante, before performing reform, people, nobody actually support, I can say most of population were against this. Another concern that I mentioned before was regarding the labor supply, which evidence show that there is no negative and most of labor supply finding show positive. Another lesson we learn is that it is very likely that beneficial reform blocked just for some administrative capacity and the lack of campaign and the belief of people. There is a bunch of other examples. This, for example, trade liberalization, which is, there is consensus on economics that this is beneficial. But if you look at the history, there is always large resistance against trade liberalization. Therefore, it is very likely that for political reasons, for psychological reasons, even efficient reform be blocked by most of population. This is really important lesson that we should keep in mind and try to smooth this process.
Yeah, I mean, points well taken. I think any major policy reform, especially a fossil fuel transition, are not easy to navigate, but you can do things well or you can do things not so well, right? And clarity and fairness and equity and bringing the public along with you is really important. And this applies to most just transition efforts, especially when there's winners and losers, right? And we need to protect the losers, especially. Jana, a little bit of pressure on you now. I give you 2 minutes for a final wrap-up question. But what I really like, and what we talked a lot about in our work on this, was that there's a lot of talk about shock responsiveness and, you can do all this emergency response, but you said, yeah, that's great, but don't forget to get the basics right. And would you like to elaborate a little bit on that just as a kind of conclusion? And then I'll wrap up. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Ian. And thanks a lot to all the panelists for this discussion. It was really, really interesting to hear these really concrete examples. Yeah, of course, this point of getting the basics right, I think is a really important one, as is, of course, adapting systems and schemes and all the discussion around shock responsive. But I think there's a lot we can do when we have a well-established functioning social protection system, right? But we need to have that in place first before we think about how to adapt it. And I think the Algeria example is a really interesting one of how, when you actually have a functioning social security system plus unemployment protection, you can then think about how to adapt it to also work for extreme heat or for extreme weather events. And I'd like to just answer this question also maybe a little bit in the context of one of the questions that we had in the chat on the people on the move, migrants, IDPs, refugees. No, I mean, getting the basics right is also about extending coverage to those kinds of populations. And at the end of the day, we need to look at the social protection system as a whole, which is composed of non-contributory and contributory benefits, right? And the logic of this is essentially that you cover as many people as you can through non-contributory benefits, as well as then providing contributory ones to people for higher levels of protection. But it's also about having this variety of different financing mechanisms, because if you have a large proportion covered by contributory, that again then also frees up resources to cover more people through the non-contributory, right? So I think this is a really important one, and especially on that point on the displaced and refugee populations. There's in the MENA region a lot of interesting work actually also around how to integrate those populations into social protection systems. I mean, Jordan, of course, comes in mind there, where you know, the Estidama program provides a really interesting experience of seeing how those migrant and refugee populations can be integrated into contributory benefit systems as well, so that you're actually not only relying only on humanitarian assistance and emergency cash support, essentially. And I think we need to sort of go through with that logic a little bit in general to see how we can sort of extend coverage from both sides, right? Not only through the non-contributory side, but also through the contributory side, because only in that way we will essentially be able to cover a large proportion of people, which is what we need if we want to get the basics right and actually be able to move to a place of resilience and sustainability, and not just be stuck in the cycle of having one emergency response after the next.
Thanks, Shanna. And I think we had a recent reminder of getting the basics right when the COVID pandemic happened, right? That those countries that had systems in place in the first instance were better able to respond quickly and more adequately than countries that had to improvise. So this kind of applies to the climate crisis, except we know it's happening and it's been happening for a long time. So listen, thank you, everyone. Like, I really appreciate the contribution from all of the panelists. Super fascinating. Thanks for all the hard work that went into this behind. I know socialprotection.org, my colleagues at the ILO, Maria Laura, Dia, and also Paolo and his team at socialprotection.org. I really appreciate that. There's a lot of effort that goes into this. And just as a final wrap up, I think I would say, look, there's been progress in the MENA region in terms of social protection coverage, but it's still too little, too slow. We need to quicken up, especially if people want to be protected against everyday risks, but also now the additional risks from the climate crisis. Thinking globally, you know, some of the countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis, and here I'm talking about small island states in particular, they're in a terrible position for facing the impact of the climate crisis. So we need to think about that globally. And we need to see, a bit like the title of this presentation or this discussion, that social protection is an enabler of climate action, is one of your strongest social policy instruments. And we need to not just think of it as something that protects you when you're ill or when you lose your job, but actually facilitating the kind of green transition that we need. And I think the universal social protection approach is part of that, part of the solution. But in order to fully harness that potential of social protection, it does require sufficient investment in social protection, and to see it as an investment and not a cost, right? And, that means in terms of your population, but also the future health of the planet, and, enjoying a livable planet and one that we can all exist in well. So there's my little John Lennon message at the end. So I'll leave it there, but thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that. And, I hope that was useful to the audience. So I declare this session over. So thanks a lot. Much appreciated. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.